if you're old enough to remember, you probably know exactly where you were on September 11th, 2001. I know I was in a seminary classroom, and we came out of the class at the end of the hour, and everybody in the hallway was just buzzing. You know, the two airplanes flying into the Twin Towers. What's happening? Why is this happening? And you probably remember over the next couple of days trying to figure out what's going on. Why did this happen? Who did this? You know, what's going to happen next? But then in all of the chaos and tragedy, something good emerged. And if you remember those days, you also remember that there was this incredible, unexpected, maybe never seen before sense that we had of national unity. People seemed to come together. There was a lot less disagreement. We weren't too concerned about politics. And this was all coming after one of the most disputed presidential elections in history. You remember the hanging chads and, you know, Florida taking forever to get their votes in? That had happened like a year ago. And so our country was very divided. Then all of a sudden we came together. And maybe nothing signified that more than a few weeks after 9/11 when President George Bush went to Game 1 of the World Series and threw out the first pitch. And some of you have seen the videos or you remember watching it live as Yankee Stadium, all of them up on their feet chanting USA, USA, and he goes out and, you know, he throws the perfect strike. And to me, I mean, that was probably the last time we'll ever see 70,000 New Yorkers cheering for a Republican president. Because things have changed, haven't they? That sense of national unity and national togetherness is just gone. In fact, if you think back and say that was only 22 years ago, and it's really almost surprising how much culture can shift and change and divide and drift apart as we have over the last 20 years. And yet we can look at it ourselves and know that it happens. And so it's no surprise when we look back into ancient history, the people of Jerusalem went through a very similar transformation. Ours was more political and national. Theirs was spiritual. That in a very brief period of time, they drifted a long, long ways from God. Now, to understand how this all happened, we go back to King Josiah. King Josiah became king in 641 BC. Remember, in BC, it goes backwards. We're counting down to 0. So he became king in 641 BC. He was only 8 years old. So he didn't really know what he was doing. His father had been a very wicked king. His grandfather had been a very wicked king. Together, the two of them had reigned for over half of a century. And so Judah and Jerusalem for over half a century had had very wicked kings. And now they've got an 8-year-old who doesn't know what he's doing. 18 years into his reign, he knows a little bit more about what he's doing now. And so he begins this renovation of the temple. And we don't know for sure what his motives were. Maybe he was just trying to beautify the city or, you know, pump up the economy by creating some construction jobs. I don't know. But in the midst of this construction on the temple, some of the workers found some old scrolls that had been buried and lost. So they brought them out and they brought them to Josiah. And Josiah, for the first time in his life, laid eyes on the word of God. Judah had been so wicked for so long that they had absolutely lost the law of Moses and the word of God. And so Josiah, for the first time in his life, reads what God has said to his people. And the Bible tells us that he wept because he realized he was not the king that God had created him to be. And his nation and his city were not the nation and the city that God had created them to be. And so he called a public proclamation and said, we're going to read these scrolls everywhere, publicly. And as the word of God was read publicly in the nation of Judah and in the city of Jerusalem, a great revival ensued. Idols were torn down. People repented. They came back to God. It was incredible. But it was short-lived. Because in 609 BC, just a few years later, King Josiah was killed in battle against Egypt. One of his sons was put in his place, but only lasted for 2 months before Egypt came and said, we'll take you. Took him as a prisoner and a captive to Egypt. And so now Josiah's son, Jehoiakim, became the king. And Jehoiakim was nothing like Josiah. Josiah was good and righteous and was for the people. Jehoiakim was evil and wicked and hated the people. And in a very brief period of time, Jehoiakim led the people away from God. In fact, it happened so quickly that by 605 BC, God sent Babylon to judge Jerusalem. Now, Babylon's attack of Jerusalem lasted for several years. In 605, they conquered the city. It demanded that the city pay taxes to them. They took the city's best and brightest young people back to Babylon with them. That included people like Daniel, like Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and it included King Jehoiakim. The total destruction of the city didn't happen until about 588 BC, several years later. But in just 20 years, from the national revival of 623 to the fall of Jerusalem in 605, the kingdom of Judah, the city of Jerusalem, went from being sold out to God to an idolatrous, immoral, and unjust city. So fast. And this is just a powerful reminder to us that culture continuously moves away from God. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. We shouldn't be surprised when we see culture around us moving quickly away from God, because Jesus actually told us to expect that. Jesus said, look, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. So don't be surprised when the world hates you, because they hated me. And if they hate the master, they will hate the servants. It shouldn't be a surprise to us to see culture run away from God. And it was in the midst of this cultural decline that God sent a prophet named Habakkuk. If you want to say Habakkuk, you can say that too. It's hard to say, hard to spell. We'll do our best. But Habakkuk came to Judah, came to Jerusalem with prophetic words from God about the coming destruction by Babylon. But what's interesting and unique about his book is that Habakkuk also asks God some questions. And in fact, the theme of the book really is this conversation between Habakkuk and God, where they're saying, Habakkuk is saying, I've got these questions, and God's saying, well, here's the answer. And what we're going to discover is that God's answers were not what he expected, but they were what he needed. And I think we'll find out that the same questions that Habakkuk was asking are the questions that we ask. And so I hope that we can get to the place where we can say, if my questions are Habakkuk's questions, then God's answers to him might also be really good for me. All right, so take your Bibles, open them up to Habakkuk chapter 1. You might have to use the table of contents for this one. If you got a phone or a tablet, you can pull it up on that. We'll put the words on the screen for you as we go. This is verse 2. Habakkuk says, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? So Habakkuk is writing in the time somewhere between 609 and 605 BC, during the reign of Jehoiakim. And when he talks about crying out violence, he's talking specifically about King Jehoiakim. 2 Kings gives us more historical background on the kings of Judah and Israel. And 2 Kings tells us that while Jehoiakim was king, the streets of Jerusalem ran with blood. He was such an unjust king. He killed anyone who disagreed with him. He was vile, he was wicked, he was corrupt, one of the worst kings in the history of Judah. And so Habakkuk says to God, how long? How long will this violence continue? Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. Habakkuk says, God, things are really bad. My own people they're immoral, they're unjust, they're corrupt, they're idolatrous. God, things are really bad. Why aren't you doing something? That's Habakkuk's first question for God. And my guess is this is a question that we ask too, isn't it? Now, Habakkuk's looking at his surrounding neighbors, and he says to God, God, if you would just judge them, they would stop. The reason they keep doing worse and worse is because you don't judge them. So God, maybe you should step in here and judge them. And I think there are times when we feel that way too, aren't there? We look around and we say, God, why don't you do something? If you would just judge people, then maybe they would turn back to you. But sometimes I think we ask this question for more personal reasons too, don't we? Maybe it's because we're waiting on something. We've asked God for something. Maybe it's healing. We say, God, why aren't you doing something? Maybe it's because we've lost something. Or maybe it's because someone is mistreating us or has mistreated us or whatever else the reason might be. If you've ever found yourself asking the question, God, why aren't you doing something? Then Habakkuk's a book for you. And I hope that as God answers Habakkuk's question, maybe you'll be able to hear an answer to your question as well. God says, verse 5, "Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told." So God says, Habakkuk, pay attention. I'm about to do something. Now, the reality is God has been working. He has been doing something. And that's the reality for us too, is that even in those times when we say, God, why aren't you doing something? The reality is he has been doing something. We maybe just haven't noticed it. But God says to Habakkuk, I'm about to do something, but it's going to blow your mind. And this is really the central theme of the book, that God's ways are not our ways. This is something we need to grasp, that God's ways are not our ways. You see, when I ask the question, God, why aren't you doing something? I'm actually making an assumption that my ways are better than his. I'm actually saying, God, look, this is how I think we should handle the situation, and I think you should probably do it now. Now, I know that there are times when that question can be asked honestly, but when I get stuck there, or when I can't let go of that question, and I keep coming back to it over and over and over again, what I'm saying is, God, hey, I think now is the time. And God says to Habakkuk, my ways are not your ways. This is what I want us to chew on this morning. Chew on this thought. That you will not always understand everything about everything. And you will never understand everything about God. Sometimes we like to think that we understand everything. But the reality is there's a lot that goes on in this world that we don't understand, isn't there? There's a lot of things that I don't understand. Like, I don't understand why God didn't make candy bars good for us and green beans bad for us, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if it's like, man, I need to get in shape. I'm going to start eating more Snickers. And if I could say, man, my doctor told me to lay off the green beans. They're bad for me. I don't understand why God didn't do it that way. I don't understand women. She's down here, she's like, nope. I've got a great one, right? And, we've got a great time, but there are those days, right? And you know why you're laughing? Because you guys don't either. But here's the thing. Just because I don't always understand women doesn't mean I can't be married and have a great marriage. And just because I don't understand why some food is good for me and other food is bad for me, it doesn't mean I stop eating. And just because I don't understand why God is not working doesn't mean I don't stop trusting. See, you've got to grasp this principle if you don't want to get stuck in life. Because too often we worship at the idol of understanding. Right? I have to understand everything. And I don't carry this into relationships, and I don't carry it into food, and there's a lot of other places this doesn't matter. But when it comes to God, if I don't completely understand everything about him and everything he's doing and not doing, then I can't trust him. And if that's your mentality, you'll always be stuck because you'll never understand. And so God is saying to Habakkuk, look, Habakkuk, you asked the question, I'm going to give you the answer, but you're not going to understand. But you still have to trust me. So here's God's answer. This is verse 6. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans. That's another word for the Babylonians. That bitter and hasty nation. So bitter and hasty, he's saying they're cruel, right? They're bitter. But when he says they're hasty, he's getting at two things. One is that they're a very impulsive, impetuous nation, but also that when they attack, they destroy, and it's fast. So God recognizes they're not good people. They're bitter and a hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Everybody's afraid of them. They're the most powerful nation on earth. They're a terrifying empire. And God says to Habakkuk, I'm raising them up. And if you keep reading, he tells Habakkuk, I'm raising them up to come and destroy Jerusalem. And Habakkuk says, I have another question, right? Because you're right, God, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand. Verse 12, Habakkuk says, O Lord, you have ordained them as judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. Notice a couple things real quick here. Notice the names that Habakkuk uses for God. He says, O Lord. And that's essentially saying master, right? Like, I'm below you, you're above me, I serve you. So he's putting himself below God here. And then he says, O rock, which is to say, I'm trusting in you, I'm depending on you, I know that you don't change. And so Habakkuk's attitude towards God is right here. And then he says, I get that we need judgment. That's what he says. He says, O Lord, you have ordained them as judgment, and you have established them for reproof. Yes, God, we've got this coming. We're a terrible nation. We deserve it. Then he goes on and he says, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. So I understand how good you are, God. I understand how righteous you are, how holy you are, how without sin you are. You are perfection. I get all of that, God. But then he says this, so why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? What Habakkuk is saying is, God, I don't understand. We're bad. I get that. We deserve judgment. I agree. We're idolatrous. We're immoral. We're unjust. That's all true. We deserve this. But God, they're a lot worse than us. Why are you letting the more wicked judge the less wicked? Another way to ask this question is, God, why do the wicked prosper? And you've probably asked this question. I do. This is my question. I have a little bit of an overdeveloped sense of justice. And so this question is one that keeps me up, because I don't understand why God lets bad people win. And there have been times in my life when this question has absolutely drove me to anxiety and despair, because it's like, God, why are you letting the bad guys win? God, why do you let the people whose hearts are so full of hate get ahead? And God, why do you let the greedy get rich and the generous stay poor? Why do the wicked prosper? Now, here's the thing. This question has assumptions too. When I ask this question, I'm also making some assumptions. I'm making some assumptions about myself, about my own sin. Because essentially what I'm saying is, okay, God, I get that I'm a sinner, but I'm a sinner at about a 5. And those guys over there, they're at like a 9. So they shouldn't get anything better than me, because I'm so much better than them. Now, Habakkuk actually gets it right when he says, God, I know that you can't see evil and you can't look at wrong. There's no degrees of sin here. Sin, even at level 1, separates us from God. My sin has separated me just as far from God as the sin of the Babylonians separated them from God. But when I say, God, why do the wicked prosper? What I'm saying is, God, I'm not them. Right? Do you see what I'm subtly doing here? They're wicked. I'm not. And the reality is, I am. Because I sin. I mess up. I say things I shouldn't. I think things I shouldn't. I respond in ways I shouldn't respond. I treat people worse than Jesus would treat them. I need grace. I need mercy just as much as they do. And here's the second assumption I'm making, and this one's maybe even worse, is I'm actually making this assumption that they don't deserve God's grace. Well, I don't deserve it either. That's what grace is. Grace is undeserved. But what I'm saying is, God, I am so grateful for your grace. Thank you. Thank you for your grace. Now, don't you dare give it to them. God, I am so fortunate that you've shown mercy to me. I am so thankful and blessed for that. Please don't show them mercy. God, thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for being patient and waiting for me to repent and come back to you. Now, please don't be patient with them. Let's just blow them up right now. That's what's behind this question. And you see, when I'm making these kind of assumptions, and I'm asking these kind of questions, why do the wicked prosper? God is saying, David, you're looking at the wrong things. And that's his response to Habakkuk. His response to Habakkuk is, Habakkuk, your eyes are in the wrong place. I want you to take your eyes off of Babylon. I want you to put your eyes on me. So this is what he says in Habakkuk 2:4. As God begins to answer Habakkuk's second question. He's talking here about Babylon, and more specifically their king Nebuchadnezzar. He says, behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. Nebuchadnezzar is a bad person. He's a prideful, arrogant person. In fact, we learn a lot more about him in the book of Daniel, and there we learn that he indeed does have a pretty significant pride problem. God says he's prideful, he's arrogant. Other places in Habakkuk that he's describing the Babylonians, he says, their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. In other words, they make up the law for themselves. They make their own rules, and they abide by their own rules. They don't listen to anyone. Later on, he says they are guilty men whose own might is their God. In other words, they worship themselves. Their strength is what they live by. Their strength is what they rely on. God's acknowledging to Habakkuk they're bad. He says, I get it, Habakkuk. They're pretty awful. Right? They're prideful, they're arrogant, they're a law to themselves, they worship themselves, they rely on their own strength. Yes, all of that is true, Habakkuk. But God's also subtly warning Habakkuk to not be like them. And I think he's subtly warning us to not be like them. Because isn't there a temptation sometimes to rely on ourselves instead of God? To follow our rules instead of his rules. And when we do that, we are the Babylonians. God's warning here against relying on your own strength. And here's why. I want you to think about this morning. Those who live by their own strength will temporarily experience victory, but will eventually be overwhelmed by something or someone more powerful. See, no matter how strong you are, someone else is stronger. No matter how smart you are, someone else is smarter. No matter how driven you are, someone else is more driven. And sometimes when we think about our own lives, we might say something like, yes, I know that God has provided salvation for me, but in this life, I need to work hard to get ahead. Yes, I know that in eternity I will be with God, but in this life I need to grow my influence if I'm going to succeed. I know that God has a plan for me down the road, but right now I just need to follow my heart and follow my passion and do what feels good. And we become the Babylonians. Now, God warns that the Babylonians will come to ruin. In fact, in chapters 2 and 3 of Habakkuk, he describes how that will happen eventually. The point being this: you can live by your strength for a while, but eventually your strength will fail. You can live by growing your influence for a while, but eventually your influence will fail. You see, the reality that God is saying is you've got to find something to live by that's not yours. Because anything that's yours will come to an end, will come to ruin. Someone else will have better, someone else will have bigger, someone else will have more, and it simply will stop to work for you. And so God provides an alternative for Habakkuk in verse 4. He says, look, Habakkuk, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, soul is puffed up, they're not upright. But listen, Habakkuk, the righteous shall live by his faith. Not by his own strength, not by his money, not by what feels good, not by influence. The righteous shall live by his faith. You see, this is really the ultimate worry about yourself statement. God is saying to Habakkuk, hey, Habakkuk, you're so worried about the Babylonians right now. And guess what, Habakkuk? You can't control them. They're going to do what they're going to do. And you can't stop it. You can't change it. And you're so worried about King Nebuchadnezzar, guess what? You can't control him either. And you know what, Habakkuk? You're even looking around at your own countrymen, at your own nation, and you're all concerned about them, and you're anxious and in despair about them. You can't control them either, Habakkuk. You know what you can control? Yourself. You can control how you live. You see, we can't control the wicked. The wicked are going to wicked. Right? I can't change how they live. I can't change what happens to them. I'm not in control of how God is going to handle that, and I don't get to make those decisions. Do you know what I do get to control? How I live. And so God says to Habakkuk, you live by faith. Now this is an action, right? It's not a think about it. It's not a talk about it. It's not, hey, just believe this and you'll be good to go. It's you need to live this way. So Habakkuk, every step you take in life, the direction you go, the choices you make, all of this, you do this by faith. And what that means is that every day, every moment, I live purposefully, steadfastly, as if I believe God is in control. Because he is. This is really what's at the heart of it, is who's in control, me or him? Because if I'm in control, I'm not going to live by faith. I'm going to live by a lot of other things. But God says this, he says the selfish are the ones who live by their income. The proud are the ones who live by influence. The overconfident are the ones who live by their own strength. The fools are the ones who live by their passions, always seeking pleasure. But the righteous live by faith. You see, the righteous who live by faith are far more concerned with the who in life than the why and the what. It's so easy for us to get stuck in the why, isn't it? God, why is this happening? Why aren't you doing something about this? And then we sit right there and until I have an explanation, until I fully understand, until this all makes sense to me, I'm not moving forward. Then I'm going to live on my own. I'm going to live by my control. God says to Habakkuk, no. The why question is not the important question. Some of us, it's the what question that trips us up, right? What is going to happen next? What does tomorrow hold? What's next year hold? What's going to come around the corner next? And we sit here and we obsess here on the what question, and it fills us with anxiety. It fills us with stress because we can't answer it. And because we're so paralyzed by the what question, we can't live by faith. We have to live by whatever we can hold on to. And until I fully understand the future, I can't live by faith. And God says to Habakkuk, no, Habakkuk, that's not it. It's not the why, it's not the what, it's the who. Who is in control? Because even if I don't understand why something is happening, I know who's in control of it. And even if I don't know what's coming tomorrow, I know who's in control of it. And so God is saying to Habakkuk, look, Habakkuk, Babylon's coming, right? Babylon's coming, and it's going to be bad. It's going to be 20 years of pain and suffering for your people. Your city's going to be destroyed. Many will be killed. Many will be carried off into captivity. Jerusalem will never be the same. But guess what? I'm still in control. I'm still in control. And I wish I could show you the end. We don't have time. The end of Habakkuk chapter 3, Habakkuk says, all this bad stuff's going to happen. The wine's going to dry up. The fields are going to be bad. There's going to be famine. It's all going to be bad. And he says, yet I will rejoice. Because God makes me like a deer. God takes care of me. God's in control. You see, to live by faith is to say, I may never have the answers I want. I may never have the understanding I want. I may never know everything that I think I need to know, but I know the one thing I need, and that's him. That's who. It's easy for us to forget about God's promises because we're so focused on our own problems. So what I want you to understand this morning is that confidence in God's promises is built by focusing on God's provision. God has made so many promises to us about what is yet to come. He promises that he'll always provide for us, and he has done that. I mean, God has provided for you. Everybody here is wearing clothes, and we're grateful for that, right? We have a roof over our heads. I'm assuming most of you will eat today, some better than others. But God provides for us. God has promised that he will protect us. And I can tell you that this is true. God has protected me in my life most often from myself. And if you're honest, this is true for you also. There are so many times in life when we make bad decisions and God protects us from the full consequences of those. Because he promises he will always protect us. He promises he will always be present. Even in the valley of the shadow of death, he will take us through it because he promises his presence. He promises that he has a plan. I mean, I can look back in my life and I can look 12 years ago, man, when I was really asking those why questions, and I was really asking those what questions. I'm like, God, why aren't you doing something? God, why do the wicked prosper? Why is this happening to me? What's coming next? And my life was just full of questions. And there was no understanding. And life made absolutely no sense. And I can look back now and say, oh, God had a plan. He was working on me. He was shaping me. He was forming me. He was fixing me. He was moving pieces in my life, and he was moving pieces elsewhere in places I had never heard of or never been because he knew where he was taking me next, and he got me from there to here because he had a plan all along, even though I couldn't see it. And if I know he was faithful then, I can trust him to be faithful later. And so the key for me is if I want to focus on God's promises instead of my problems, I do that by focusing on his past provision. We call that gratitude, right? And you guys know, if you've been here for any period of time, I love to talk about gratitude because I think gratitude, unlike almost anything else, really grows our faith. Because when we focus on what God has done for us, it changes us. Fast forward to the New Testament, Philippians chapter 4. Paul is writing this letter from jail. He's in prison. And I don't know about you. I mean, I've never been in prison. But if I was, I'd be asking the questions, wouldn't you? Why am I here? What's going on? What's coming next? God, why aren't you fixing this for me? But Paul's not doing that. Listen to what Paul says. He says, do not be anxious about anything. Not even about being in prison. Do not be anxious about anything. But in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Now, watch this. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. You see what Paul is saying here? What Paul is saying is peace is better than understanding. And this is completely opposite to how we normally think about it. Because normally what we think is, I will have peace when I have understanding. When I know why this is happening, then I can be at peace with it. When I know what's coming next, then I'll be at peace. When the uncertainty is gone, that's when I'll have peace. And Paul's like, no, actually, that's not it at all. He says, peace surpasses understanding. You're never going to have understanding. There will always be things in life that don't make sense. And you can still be at peace. It doesn't have to drive you to anxiety. How do you do that? Well, he gives us the formula here, right? He says it's through prayer and supplication and thanksgiving. Supplication simply means making requests. And what Paul is saying is the way you have peace in the midst of uncertainty, the way you have peace when you don't have understanding, is you take it to God. You simply go to him and you say, look, this is out of my control. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on what I can control and give the rest to him. I'm going to take action where I can and pray about what I can't. I just simply go to him. This is what it means. Prayer, supplication, and thanksgiving is simply this. God, I don't know what's going on here. I trust that you do. Now, here's what I'd like to happen. God's okay with us saying that. Here's what I'd like to happen, but I trust you. And now let me focus on why I'm thankful. And I begin to focus on how he's provided. And I begin to focus on how he's protected. And I begin to focus on how he's been present. And I've been focused on how he's worked out his plan in my life. I look into the past and see his provision in the past so I can have confidence for the future. You see, gratitude changes our lives. One of my great desires for you and for our church is that we be a church that's marked by gratitude. So this year we've been doing our monthly challenges. And of course, it's November, it's Thanksgiving month. So our monthly challenge is all about gratitude. And here it is. By Thanksgiving, write down 100 reasons you are thankful. Now, if you want to have a cool handout to do that on, you can download that sheet right there by using the QR code if you want to do that. But you don't have to do that. You can write it on a journal or a scrap piece of paper or type it into your notes app, whatever you want to do. But by Thanksgiving, write down 100 reasons you're thankful. And I guarantee you this, as you focus on gratitude in your life, it will begin to change you. And so we're going to start this morning all together by giving thanks for the most important thing in our lives, which is Jesus, right? So every time we come to the communion table, what we're doing is we're saying thank you to God for Jesus.